Imagine standing on the deck of a Royal Navy cruiser in the Arctic winter. The sea is black and freezing. The wind cuts through every layer of clothing, and somewhere out there are U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers waiting for you. This was life aboard HMS Belfast, a ship that fought from the icy north to the beaches of Normandy. Hi, my name is Sam, and welcome to Eyes Shut History, before we sail into battle. If you like these stories and feel like you have learned something from these videos, then please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me write more stories for you guys. Now, sit back, relax, and let your eyes shut to history. But before the cold seas and the thunder of guns, HMS Belfast began her life in steel and ceremony. She was launched on St. Patrick's Day, 1938, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, the same yard that had built the Titanic a generation earlier. The crowd that gathered to watch was smaller, less glamorous, but the mood was no less proud. The Royal Navy's new cruiser slid into the water, a sleek grey hull cutting through the slipway, christened by Anne Chamberlain, wife of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. At 613 feet long, with 12 6-inch guns mounted in 4 triple turrets, Belfast was designed as one of the most powerful cruisers of her time. She was part of the Town class, a series of modern ships built to project British naval power across the globe. Her speed, firepower, and armor made her a formidable presence, not as massive as a battleship, but faster and more flexible, able to escort convoys, hunt enemy raiders, and support land operations with heavy bombardment. In 1938, her decks gleamed, her engines purred, and her crew, drawn from every corner of Britain, settled into a routine of drills and training. Few of them could have imagined what lay ahead: the Atlantic storms, the Arctic convoys, the thunder of battle against Germany's mightiest warships. For now, Belfast was a symbol of pride, the newest tool in Britain's long tradition of sea power. When war came in September 1939, Belfast was ready. She joined the 18th Cruiser Squadron, patrolling the North Sea, enforcing the blockade against Germany and hunting for enemy ships. Life on board quickly hardened from peacetime polish to wartime grind. Long watches on the open bridge, the endless grey sea stretching in every direction, the threat of submarines always lurking. To the men aboard, the ship was both home and fortress. Mess decks were crowded, hammocks slung close together, meals eaten quickly in the hum of engines. Daily routine meant cleaning, drilling, and constant readiness. The Belfast was alive with sound, the clang of hammers in the engine rooms, the thump of boots on steel decks, the chatter of typewriters in the signals office. Above all, the deep, steady thrum of her turbines drove her forward day and night. Yet danger came quickly. On 21st November 1939, just months into the war, HMS Belfast struck a German magnetic mine while leaving the Firth of Forth. The explosion tore through her hull, wrecked her machinery, and left her crippled. Shockwaves rippled through the ship. Men were thrown from their feet. Bulkheads shuddered. Alarms screamed. Smoke and seawater flooded compartments, but the crew fought back with discipline drilled into them. Damage control teams sealed hatches. Pumps roared to life. Fires were doused. Miraculously, Belfast did not sink. Her watertight compartments held, and she limped back to port, battered but afloat. Casualties were relatively light compared to what might have been, but the ship herself was out of the war. The mine had done its work. Belfast would spend nearly 3 years in dockyard hands, undergoing extensive repairs and modernization. For her crew, it was a strange exile. Some were reassigned to other ships, scattered across the fleet. Others remained with Belfast, watching her stripped, rebuilt, and improved. By the time she returned to service in 1942, she was a different ship, stronger, better armored, with advanced radar systems that made her one of the most modern cruisers afloat. The mine that had nearly ended her career had, in a way, given her a second beginning. As Belfast prepared to rejoin the fleet, the war at sea had changed. The Atlantic was now a battlefield of convoys and U-boats. The Arctic Convoys carried supplies to the Soviet Union, braving ice, storms, and relentless German attacks. And in the north, the German battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst threatened Allied shipping like wolves in the pack. Belfast would be sent into this new arena, colder, harsher, and deadlier than anything she had faced before. Her crew knew what it meant. The Royal Navy had a tradition. Ships were more than steel. They had personalities, reputations, even souls. Belfast was spoken of with pride. She was fast, she was modern. She had survived her wounding and come back stronger. To the men who served aboard her, she was not just a ship. She was their home, their protector, their identity. When she sailed north in 1942 into freezing seas and endless daylight, HMS Belfast was no longer the polished cruiser of 1938. She was a warship reborn, ready to face the hardest seas and the fiercest battles of the Second World War. And from that moment, her story truly began. The outbreak of war in 1939 transformed HMS Belfast from a peacetime cruiser into a frontline warship overnight. Gone were the ceremonial drills and exercises of the summer. Now the orders were blunt: enforce the blockade, protect merchant shipping, and hunt for German surface raiders. In those first tense months, later nicknamed the Phony War, much of the fighting on land was still to come. But at sea, the war was already deadly serious. Britain relied on imports for food, oil, and raw materials. German U-boats and surface raiders were unleashed to choke those lifelines. Belfast, with her speed and long range, was sent into the North Sea to intercept enemy shipping. Patrol duty was monotonous but exhausting. Watches were long, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, with no end in sight. Sailors stood shivering on open decks, eyes scanning endless grey waves for periscopes or shadows of enemy ships. Radar was primitive, weather often brutal, and the sea itself an enemy. Every sighting mattered. A suspicious silhouette on the horizon could be a neutral vessel, a German blockade runner, or a disguised raider. Boarding parties were launched in small boats, sailors clambering up wet hulls to check papers and cargo. Sometimes they found contraband and seized ships. More often they found nothing, then returned cold and wet, only to do it all again the next day. It was dangerous work. German mines were already being laid off Britain's coasts, and merchant convoys were under constant threat. Belfast's crew lived with the knowledge that beneath the calm grey water, death could lurk unseen. On the 21st of November 1939, that danger became real. Belfast was steaming out of the Firth of Forth when a magnetic mine detonated beneath her hull. Unlike traditional contact mines, which required a ship to physically hit them, magnetic mines were triggered by the magnetic field of a passing vessel. They could be laid from aircraft, dropped silently into shipping lanes, and wait invisibly for prey. The blast was devastating. It lifted the cruiser out of the water, snapping equipment, wrecking her internal machinery. Men were hurled against bulkheads, steam pipes burst, compartments flooded. The noise was deafening, a single concussive boom that left ears ringing. Panic could have spread, but Belfast's crew responded with the discipline drilled into them. Damage control parties slammed watertight doors, rigged pumps, and fought flooding with sandbags and shoring timbers. Fire parties scrambled through smoke-filled compartments, dragging hoses, dousing sparks before they spread. Medics treated the wounded in cramped aid stations, their hands slick with blood and oil. The ship slowed to a crawl, her machinery wrecked, her decks scarred. But she did not sink. Her designers had given her strong compartmentalization, and it saved her. With help from tugs and escorts, she limped back to Rosyth, battered but afloat. For the crew, the shock lingered. The mine had proved how vulnerable even a modern warship could be. In letters home, sailors wrote cautiously, skirting censorship but hinting at how close they had come. Families reading between the lines understood the truth. Their sons, husbands, and brothers had been lucky to survive. The aftermath was long and frustrating. Belfast was out of action for nearly 3 years. She was towed into dock, stripped of her wrecked machinery, and rebuilt piece by piece. The process was painstaking, but it also became an opportunity. Naval architects used the downtime to modernize her. Her hull was strengthened, her armor improved, her radar and fire control systems upgraded. By the time she re-entered service in 1942, she was no longer just repaired. She was one of the most advanced cruisers in the Royal Navy. For her crew, those years were a limbo. Some were reassigned to other ships and fought in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, even at Dunkirk. Others stayed with Belfast, working alongside dockyard crews, watching their ships slowly come back to life. Sailors who had joined her in peacetime returned to find an unfamiliar vessel. Her silhouette altered, her systems new, her spirit the same. The mine had nearly ended Belfast's story before it began. Instead, it gave her a second life, harder, stronger, and better prepared for the brutal years ahead. When HMS Belfast steamed out of the dockyard in late 1942, she was not the same ship that had limped back 3 years earlier. The mine that had nearly ended her career had forced a transformation. Now she was stronger, heavier, and far more lethal. Her armor belt had been thickened. Her radar and fire control systems were state-of-the-art. New anti-aircraft guns bristled on her decks. To the sailors who returned to her, Belfast felt both familiar and strangely new, a ship reborn. Her first major task in this second life was one of the Royal Navy's most grueling duties, the Arctic Convoys. These convoys were lifelines. From 1941 onward, Britain and her allies shipped vital supplies to the Soviet Union: tanks, trucks, fuel, food, ammunition. Without these, the Red Army would have struggled to hold the Eastern Front. But the route was a nightmare. North around Norway, across the Barents Sea, to ports like Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. It meant running a gauntlet of German submarines, surface ships, and aircraft, all while enduring some of the worst weather on Earth. Belfast joined the escort forces in 1943, sailing out into seas that were less forgiving than any enemy. The Arctic winter was a weapon in its own right. Temperatures plunged below freezing, salt spray turned to ice on decks and gun barrels, and storms rolled across the convoy routes with waves as tall as houses. Sailors hacked at the ice with axes, knowing the build-up could capsize the ship if left unchecked. Boots froze to the deck, hands went numb inside gloves, and faces blistered with frostbite. In these conditions, even routine duties became ordeals. Lookouts scanned the horizon with eyes streaming from the cold, searching for the periscope wake of a U-boat. Gun crews stood by their weapons hour after hour, snow crusting on their greatcoats, waiting for the dark speck of an incoming bomber. The ship's cooks served meals that froze solid before they reached the upper deck. And always there was the enemy. German U-boats stalked the convoys, firing torpedoes from beneath the waves. The Luftwaffe launched raids from bases in Norway, Heinkel bombers swooping low through snow squalls. The great fear was the German surface fleet, ships like the battleship Tirpitz and the battlecruiser Scharnhorst, which could obliterate merchant convoys in a single sortie if they broke through. Belfast's radar became one of her greatest weapons. In the Arctic gloom, where daylight was short and storms constant, Radar gave the escorts a chance to spot threats before they struck. Her crew grew skilled at interpreting the green blips on their screens, voices tense as they tracked incoming raids or plotted the positions of U-boats. The strain on sailors was immense. Convoys crept northward at the speed of their slowest merchant ships, often no more than 8 or 9 knots. Days blurred into nights, the cold never lifted, and danger was never far away. Sailors spoke later of the eerie beauty of those voyages, the northern lights shimmering above, icebergs looming ghostly in the dark, the sky alive with tracers when attacks came. In March 1943, during convoy JW53, Belfast and her escorts faced the full fury of the Arctic. A massive storm scattered the convoy, ships lost touch with one another, and German bombers pounced. The escorts fought back furiously, Belfast's anti-aircraft guns hammering at the sky, but losses were heavy. Merchant ships burned on the horizon, crews abandoning them into freezing seas where survival was measured in minutes. Sailors on Belfast watched in silence, powerless to save them, and knew the same fate could come for them at any moment. Still, the convoys endured, and Belfast's role was vital. Her guns, her radar, her presence deterred German surface raiders from making easy work of the merchantmen. Her crew learned to live with the cold, to joke about frostbitten fingers, to sing songs in the mess, as the ship rolled and pitched in endless storms. They built a rhythm of survival. Man the guns, chip the ice, drink hot tea, repeat. For the Soviet sailors and civilians who received the convoys, these missions meant life. Tanks rumbled off the cargo ships, fuel drums were rolled ashore, and grain sacks were unloaded by the thousand. Every crate had been bought with sweat, frostbite, and blood. For Belfast, the Arctic Convoys forged her reputation. She had survived a mine, she had endured 3 years in dock, and now she had proved herself in one of the most brutal theaters of the war. Her crew carried the scars of cold and loss, but they also carried pride. They knew they had helped hold the line against Hitler in the East, and they knew their ship had earned her place among the greats of the fleet. And soon, Belfast would face her greatest test yet, a battle not against the weather or the U-boats, but against one of Germany's most feared warships. By the winter of 1943, the Arctic convoys had become a deadly routine, but the threat of Germany's great surface raiders still hung over every voyage. Of all the enemy ships, one name sent a chill through Allied sailors, Scharnhorst. The Scharnhorst was a German battle cruiser, fast, heavily armed, and built to hunt convoys. With her 11-inch guns and high speed, she could outrun or outgun most escorts. For the men of the Arctic convoys, she was the nightmare made steel. If she broke into a convoy, destruction would follow. On Christmas Day, 1943, HMS Belfast was part of the escort for convoy JW55B, heading toward the Soviet Union. The convoy plowed through freezing seas. 19 merchant ships laden with supplies, their decks covered in ice. Belfast, along with other Royal Navy warships, shielded them from what everyone knew could come at any moment. That moment came on the 26th of December. The German Navy had sent Scharnhorst to intercept the convoy. Her orders were simple: destroy it. But the Royal Navy was ready. Through intelligence and careful planning, Admiral Bruce Fraser had laid a trap. Belfast was part of a cruiser force positioned to shadow and harass the German ship, driving her toward the battleship Duke of York, which waited with heavier guns. At 9 a.m., Belfast's radar made contact. In the gray Arctic dawn, visibility was poor. Snow squalls and sleet hid the horizon. But the radar told the truth. A blip appeared, large, fast-moving, unmistakable. Scharnhorst. The order was given, shadow and engage. Belfast, along with HMS Norfolk and HMS Sheffield, closed in. At 9:30 a.m., Belfast fired star shells into the gloom, great bursts of light that hung in the sky, illuminating the German battlecruiser for all to see. Her guns followed, opening fire across the heaving seas. The battle that followed was a brutal, running fight across the Arctic. Belfast's role was not to finish Scharnhorst herself, but to keep contact, to harry, to ensure the trap was sprung. Time and again, Belfast's radar-guided guns lit the sky with shell fire, forcing the German ship to maneuver, buying precious minutes. Her radar teams called bearings. Her gunners hammered away. Her crew braced as return fire whistled past. Scharnhorst fought back hard. Her guns roared, shells plunging into the sea around Belfast. Splinters tore across decks, and sailors flinched as fountains of water erupted dangerously close. The noise was relentless. The roar of Belfast's own turrets, the boom of enemy fire, the crash of waves on steel. But radar gave the Royal Navy the edge. While Scharnhorst's crew struggled in poor visibility, Belfast and her sisters could track her every move. Voices in Belfast's operations room called out bearings, distances, corrections. Her gunners adjusted and fired again, shells arching invisibly through sleet toward their target. By afternoon, the trap closed. Admiral Fraser's battleship Duke of York arrived, her 14-inch guns dwarfing anything Belfast carried. The engagement shifted from a running fight to a hammering. Belfast kept up her fire, her shells striking Scharnhorst's superstructure, damaging her radar and guns. The German ship fought on, battered but still deadly. Her crew showed grim discipline, firing back even as damage mounted. But as darkness fell, the outcome was sealed. Torpedoes from destroyers struck home, explosions ripping through her hull. The battlecruiser slowed, her great silhouette listing, fires raging across her decks. At 7:45 p.m., Scharnhorst rolled and sank into the freezing Barents Sea. Of her crew of almost 2,000 men, only 36 survived. The rest went down with their ship lost in the black Arctic waters. For the men of HMS Belfast, the victory was both triumph and tragedy. They had helped end the threat of one of Germany's most dangerous warships, securing the Arctic routes once and for all. The convoys would sail with less fear now, their cargoes reaching the Soviet Union in greater safety. But they had also watched nearly 2,000 sailors die in a single night. In the mess, sailors smoked in silence, faces drawn. Some muttered that it was war, nothing more. Others stared into their tea, thinking of men on the other side who had done their duty as they had, and who would never see another dawn. The Battle of North Cape became Belfast's defining moment. She had lit the way, her star shells turning night into day, her guns pounding, her radar guiding the fleet. In the official record, her role was clear. She had been the eyes of the battle, the first to engage, the last to lose contact. For her crew, it was a memory burned deep. The roar of the guns, the glare of the star shells, the shock wave of explosions across the sea, and finally, the silence after the storm, the icy waters closing over a ship that had once terrified them all. Belfast had faced the Arctic's greatest predator and survived. The next time she fired her guns in anger, it would not be in the frozen north, but across the beaches of France. In June 1944, HMS Belfast sailed into an entirely different war. Gone were the freezing Arctic gales and the radar duels against German warships. Now, the great grey cruiser steamed south into the English Channel, part of the vast armada gathering for the Allied invasion of Europe. Operation Overlord. For months, sailors had heard rumors, seen the build-up in ports, and guessed at the scale of what was coming. Now the guessing was over. Belfast was assigned to Force E, one of the naval groups supporting the landings. Her task was to deliver heavy gunfire onto German defenses along the Normandy coast. It was not glamorous work. She would not duel enemy cruisers or chase raiders. Instead, her 12 6-inch guns would pound bunkers, artillery batteries, and troop concentrations, softening the way for Allied soldiers to storm ashore. The preparation was immense. Charts of the French coast were spread across tables, target lists drawn up in detail. Each gun crew studied the coordinates they would fire on, rehearsing the process of loading and elevating their turrets. Signals officers drilled in the routines of receiving spotting reports from aircraft and forward observers. Every man aboard knew his role, down to the second. On the night of June 5th, Belfast slipped from her anchorage, part of the invasion fleet heading across the channel. The sea was choked with ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, transports, the largest fleet ever assembled. Sailors leaned over the rails, staring at the endless procession of vessels, the horizon crowded with silhouettes. Some whistled quietly, others fell silent. Everyone understood the scale of what they were about to attempt. At dawn on June 6th, Belfast opened fire. The roar of her guns shook the decks. Turret after turret thundered, shells shrieking into the sky, arcing toward the French coast. In the operations room, officers marked fall of shot, correcting, adjusting, firing again. On the beaches, German bunkers shuddered under the impact. Concrete cracked, earth geysered into the air. For the gun crews, it was relentless. Shells were hauled, loaded, rammed, fired. The breeches slammed open and shut. The guns recoiled with each blast, the air filled with smoke and cordite. Men's ears rang despite ear protection. Their shoulders ached from the rhythm of loading, but they kept at it hour after hour. Soldiers on shore remembered the sound. The rumble of Belfast's guns carried across the beaches, a steady drumbeat of support. Some swore the ship's shells saved their lives, smashing German positions that would otherwise have torn the landings apart. The thunder overhead gave them courage, a reminder that the Navy was watching over them. From Belfast's decks, sailors could see the invasion unfold. Landing craft crawled toward the beaches, black dots in the dawn light. Smoke rose as German artillery found its mark. Tiny figures scrambled ashore, some falling, some pressing forward. It was a strange perspective, distant, almost detached, but never less than real. They knew their shells were clearing the way for those men, and they fired with grim determination. The German response was fierce. Shore batteries targeted the warships, shells splashing into the sea, some exploding dangerously close. Belfast's crew braced at the sound of incoming fire, the crash of near misses sending spray across her decks. But the cruiser kept firing, her turrets swinging, her guns hammering. For days after D-Day, Belfast remained off the French coast, delivering bombardment in support of the advancing troops. She shifted targets inland, blasting railway lines, road junctions, and strong points. Her guns were the long arm of the Allied armies, reaching deep behind the beaches. The work was exhausting. Gun crews slept in snatches, muscles sore, ears ringing. Officers worked by lamplight, plotting new targets, relaying coordinates. Sailors chipped rust, scrubbed decks, kept machinery running under relentless strain. The rhythm was familiar in one sense: duty, endurance, repetition. But unlike the Arctic, this time the horizon was filled not with ice and waves, but with fire and liberation. When at last the order came to stand down, Belfast's crew looked out at the beaches of Normandy, now firmly in Allied hands. The cost had been high. Thousands of soldiers killed and wounded, ships lost, aircraft downed. But the invasion had succeeded. Europe was opening again, one beachhead at a time. For Belfast, D-Day became another defining moment. Her guns had spoken for Britain once more, not against a single enemy warship this time, but across an entire front. Her crew carried the pride of knowing they had been part of the greatest amphibious operation in history. And yet, even as the beaches of Normandy faded behind her, Belfast's war was not over. Ahead lay another ocean, another climate, another challenge entirely. The Arctic cold and the Channel's grey seas would give way to the heat and humidity of the Far East, and Belfast would sail there, too. By the end of 1944, HMS Belfast had seen two very different wars. She had fought in the frozen Arctic against German surface raiders, and she had thundered her guns across the beaches of Normandy. But the war in Europe was moving steadily toward its conclusion, and the Royal Navy began to turn its attention eastward, to the Pacific, where the struggle against Japan raged on. For Belfast and her crew, the redeployment was both a relief and a shock. Relief, because the great duels with Germany's navy were over. Shock, because the war in the Far East presented challenges unlike anything they had faced before. The first difference was climate. Men who had chipped ice off decks in the Barents Sea now found themselves sweating under a blazing sun. Steel decks grew hot enough to blister hands. Humidity soaked uniforms, salt clung to skin, and the once welcome warmth of the engine rooms became stifling. Sailors hacked tropical uniforms into makeshift shorts, hung hammocks on open decks for cooler air, and cursed the relentless mosquitoes that came with every evening. The sea was different, too. Instead of grey storms and rolling Atlantic swells, the Pacific shimmered blue and calm until a typhoon arrived. Then waves towered higher than Arctic gales, and Belfast rolled and pitched as if tossed by a giant's hand. The enemy was different as well. In the Arctic, German U-boats and battleships had been the threat. In Normandy, shore batteries and bunkers. In the Pacific, Belfast faced kamikaze attacks. Japanese pilots, flying their aircraft with the sole purpose of crashing them into Allied ships, introduced a new kind of terror. Radar picked them up, gunners opened fire, but every approach felt personal. Every plane that dived toward the fleet carried a man intent on dying to take others with him. Belfast joined the British Pacific Fleet in 1945, part of the Allied naval power gathering to strike Japan's empire. Her duties included escorting carriers, bombarding coastal positions, and screening the fleet against air attack. In some ways it was routine, the same drills, the same endless watches, but the context was utterly changed. Now she was part of operations across thousands of miles of ocean, where distances dwarfed anything in Europe. Her crew adapted quickly. Gun crews learned to track fast-diving aircraft instead of lumbering bombers. Signalers studied the unfamiliar names of Pacific islands. The cooks tried to adjust menus for the new climate, though supplies often ran short and tinned rations remained the staple. One memory sailors carried was of bombardments against Japanese-held islands. Belfast's guns, which had shaken Normandy, now thundered in tropical heat, shells hammering coastal batteries and airstrips. The sound was the same, the concussion through the decks the same, but the scenery was alien. Palm trees shredded instead of hedgerows, coral beaches instead of French sand. By mid-1945, the end of the war was in sight. American forces had captured island after island, drawing closer to Japan itself. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. The Japanese surrender followed. For Belfast's crew, the war ended not with one last battle, but with the sudden quiet that followed Japan's capitulation. They had steamed halfway around the world to fight in the Pacific, prepared for a bloody invasion of Japan that never came. Relief spread through the mess decks when the surrender was announced. Men cheered, cried, or simply sat in stunned silence. The long war was over. For HMS Belfast, it marked the close of her World War II journey. She had survived a mine that might have sunk her, fought in Arctic gales, faced Germany's most feared warships, fired across Normandy, and steamed into the Pacific to stand ready against Japan. Few ships had seen such varied service across so many theaters. As peace returned, the crew looked back with pride, exhaustion, and sometimes disbelief. They had lived through nearly every extreme the war at sea could offer. Ice and fire, silence and thunder, triumph and loss. And now, at last, they could go home. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, HMS Belfast did not fade quietly into history. She was too modern, too valuable, and still had life in her hull. While many of her contemporaries were paid off or scrapped, Belfast sailed on into a new and uncertain world, the Cold War. Her first post-war duties reflected the shifting map of empire and geopolitics. Belfast was dispatched to the Far East, patrolling waters that were suddenly unstable. In 1945 and 1946, she supported the reoccupation of former Japanese territories, carrying supplies and personnel, helping to restore order. For her crew, it was strange to be steaming into ports where the war had ended only weeks earlier, Japanese signs still hanging in place, Allied flags newly hoisted. By 1949, Belfast was back in active service as a cruiser of the Royal Navy's Far East Fleet. Then came Korea. When war broke out on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, Belfast was one of the first Royal Navy ships to arrive. She provided gunfire support for United Nations forces ashore, bombarding railways, bridges, and coastal positions to slow the North Korean advance. The work was demanding, but familiar. Once again, her 6-inch guns pounded enemy positions. Once again, her sailors manned guns, tended machinery, and endured long deployments far from home. Unlike the Second World War, however, the enemy this time had no great fleets. Belfast's guns spoke more often against land targets. Her radar watched for aircraft, and her presence projected Allied strength off the Korean coast. Through the 1950s, Belfast continued to serve. She steamed in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Far East. She trained cadets, hosted dignitaries, and represented Britain at foreign ports. For younger sailors, she was simply their first ship, noisy, crowded, steel grey, but home nonetheless. For veterans of the Second World War still aboard, she carried memories of colder seas and harder fights. By the 1960s, however, time caught up with her. Naval technology had moved on. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, and nuclear submarines were reshaping warfare at sea. The great gun cruisers, once the pride of fleets, were becoming obsolete. In 1963, HMS Belfast was paid off into reserve. She was no longer needed. Her fate seemed clear. Most warships ended their days in the breaker's yard, cut apart for scrap, their steel melted down for new industries. Belfast seemed destined for the same end, but a group of veterans, historians, and naval enthusiasts thought differently. They argued that her history, from Arctic Convoys to Normandy, from Scharnhorst to Korea, made her too important to lose. She was a witness to a global conflict, a survivor of an era when Britain's fate hung by a thread. Their campaign succeeded. In 1971, instead of the scrapyard, Belfast was moored permanently on the Thames in London. She became a museum ship open to the public, preserved as a floating monument to the men and women of the Royal Navy. Today, visitors walk her decks where sailors once chipped ice in Arctic gales. They stand in her gun turrets, gaze at the cramped mess decks, peer into the engine rooms. They hear recordings of sailors' voices, see photographs of convoys and bombardments, and try to imagine what it was to live and fight aboard her. From the river, her grey hull rises against the skyline, a silent sentinel between Tower Bridge and the modern city. Tourists and commuters pass her daily, some pausing, some barely noticing. Yet for those who step aboard, Belfast tells her story still. Not of glory alone, but of endurance, hardship, and survival. She is one of the very few warships of her kind left in the world. Where most of her sisters are gone, reduced to scrap or memory, Belfast remains. She is a survivor, twice over, of a German mine in 1939, and of the scrapyard 3 decades later. Her legacy is not only steel and rivets, but memory. She represents the sailors who endured the Arctic, the convoys, the battles, the bombardments. She represents a time when Britain's fate turned on the sea, when ships like hers stood between invasion and survival. For school children, she is a history lesson made real. For veterans, she is a place of memory. For the curious, she is a glimpse into a world of hammocks and mess tins, radar screens, and gun turrets. HMS Belfast's story did not end with the Second World War. It lives on, moored in quiet water, her guns pointed silently downriver. She no longer fights, but she still speaks to anyone willing to walk her decks and listen. Thank you for listening, and good night to you all.